What do a carriage weight, false teeth, and cakes have in common? You're about to find out on this episode of Forgotten Felonies.
Welcome back to Forgotten Felonies. I'm Monica.
And I'm Olivia.
And this is where we take you back in time to rediscover the tales of vintage villainy the time forgot. This case came to our attention when we were covering the Alfred Knapp case. When Alfred Knapp was in jail and they were investigating his crimes, they likened Alfred to a few other killers.
Yes, and I looked them up and realized they would make great episodes.
Indeed. This one sounded particularly interesting. So let's walk back in time to Tuesday, September 23rd of 1902. The crowd had been gathering at the Grand Central Station in New York City since before 8 o'clock a.m. The man who had been so prominent in the papers recently was going to be coming in on a train, brought back in handcuffs. They wanted to see him. They wanted to see for themselves the man who had done something so horrific. The crowd swelled to 400, 500, eventually close to 1,000 people by some accounts. Whenever a train approached, the crowd would surge forward toward the gate just in case this was the train that they'd been waiting for. When it wasn't, they'd fall back a bit and wait for the next. There was a loud hum as they all spoke about the horrible details that had been printed in the newspapers. Finally, at 9:21 a.m., the Bridgeport train rolled in. This was it. The crowd was pressing against the gate. The prisoner was terrified by what might happen, but the detectives with him were calm. They ordered the police and the staff at the station to clear a path down the middle of the crowd so they could get through to their waiting wagon. They rushed their prisoner through this open column as the crowd hooted and jeered. Finally, after days of searching, Hooper Young was back in New York City, and now they might finally have answers to the unspeakable murder of Annie Pulitzer.
William Hooper Young was born March 13, 1871 in Salt Lake City, Utah. His father was John Willard Young, son of Brigham Young, and his mother was Elizabeth Canfield Young. John Willard was a polygamist, so if I were to name all of his wives and children, we would be here for a while. During 1891 and 1892, William Hooper served an LDS mission in the Eastern States Mission. In 1893, after he had returned home from his mission, he left Salt Lake City again and began traveling around the United States. His stops included Portland, Oregon, Seattle, San Francisco, Chicago, New York, Hoboken, and Washington, D.C. At some point, he did return to Salt Lake and married Camilla Peterson on January 19, 1894. A couple months later, a son, Francis Henry Young, was born.
While Hooper Young was a grandson of Brigham Young, and had obviously been part of the LDS Church when he was growing up, he had left the church about 15 years prior to this happening. His mother left the church as well, and she divorced her husband and moved to Washington State, where she was originally from, and she married a doctor. Hooper's mother had been John Young's first wife, and she was apparently fine with the polygamy thing right up until he married his fifth wife. Here's a quote from her, and she calls her son William, but she's talking about William Hooper Young, who just went by Hooper later.
My husband was infatuated with his fifth wife. There was no place for William in the home of the favorite wife, and he was sent first to a cattle ranch owned by his father in northern Arizona, and then was brought north again to work upon the railway. He was 17 or 18 years old. Left practically homeless, he went the way of others of his brothers.
When his mother and father divorced, his mother took her 3 girls with her to Washington, and John took the 2 boys. Hooper hadn't had anything to do with his father from about 1889 to 1902. His father, John, was incredibly wealthy. He had been a railroad man, and he's given credit for building up the railroads in Utah. In 1902, he was living without any of his wives in New York City. He'd rented a few apartments in the Clarence Building located at 103 West 58th Street. This was a very high-end sort of apartment complex, very luxurious and expensive. And John had rented 3 apartments, all right next to each other on the second floor. They were modified, so they were turned into one giant apartment. He wanted the extra room so that the Mormon missionaries who would come to that area would have a place to stay. In September of 1902, John W. Young was in Paris, trying to seal a big business deal. He was going to be gone for a very long time, but he left his domestic staff in charge of keeping up his luxurious home in his absence. And somehow, Hooper Young had heard that his father was gone, and he approached the staff, who decided that it would be all right for Hooper to stay there. Hooper moved into the apartment that was in the middle of the three.
Well, it sounds like they didn't know that Hooper and his dad didn't talk to each other.
I'm sure just saying that he was John's son made them assume that all was well and it would be fine. He had 7 sons that I see on Find Grave, like from all of his wives, and possibly he hadn't told the domestic staff that he wasn't speaking to one of them because maybe that was embarrassing, or, I mean, it had been, so many years that maybe it just wasn't at the front of his mind.
So, did his dad know he was staying there?
He did not. Apparently, he had given complete permission to his staff to handle things, and so they let Hooper live there, and, that was that. Hooper was into some bad habits. He had left Mormonism behind entirely, and he smoked like a chimney, and he drank like a fish. Now, this is not something that a Mormon would be doing, so you can see how he fell very far off the wagon. He loved rum and whiskey, and he loved cigars and, of course, cigarettes, but I think cigars were his favorite. At the time that all of this happened, that we're talking about, the newspapers never said anything about any illicit drugs of any kind. So no cocaine or whatever was going around in 1902. Years later, however, there was an article that stated, quote, "It was a well-known fact that Hooper Young was a morphine fiend." But I call BS on that because it would absolutely have been in the papers at the time if that was actually a thing. I mean, trust me, it would have been in the papers. Hooper bounced from city to city, chasing journalism jobs. He was really into writing. He worked briefly for the Butte Miner in Butte, Montana. He tried insurance in Seattle and then founded a small paper there called Saturday Court News. Now, interestingly, this paper was suppressed by the police as indecent literature. So I don't really know why, but yeah, something was wrong with what he was writing. He then spent some time in Tacoma, possibly spent some time in Portland, and ultimately he teamed up with a man named Richard Dixie Anzer. So it was Richard, but then they called him Dixie. They paired up together, and they actually moved over to Hoboken, New Jersey, where Dixie was from, and they founded a newspaper called The Crusader. This small paper only existed between March of 1901 and June of 1902. The newspapers said that it died a quiet death. So just like his paper in Seattle, there were some controversial articles and opinions in there. Hooper acted as the business manager of the paper, and he'd go around selling ads, trying to generate income to keep the little paper going. But he also wrote articles. When he was the author of an article, the topic was typically always religion or vices, such as, drugs, prostitution, gambling, and other activities that were part of a city's underbelly. He was very fanatic with his views, and he wanted to see action taken. Once he went to the office of Detective Sergeant Julius Nelson to talk about all of the vices happening around town, and then he hinted that the police were simply looking the other way, and he was going to expose them if they didn't crack down. Well, Detective Nelson didn't like that, so he told him to leave. And Hooper wouldn't leave, so Detective Nelson had to physically remove him from his office. Now, let's turn our attention to Annie Pulitzer.
Anna C. Nielsen was born September 27, 1874 in Perth Amboy, Middlesex, New Jersey. Her parents were Erasmus Nielsen and Clara E. Robertson Nielsen. She also had 3 brothers, Frank, Peter, and Antony. We really aren't sure the exact spelling of her last name. We've seen it Nilsson, Nielsen, Nelson. So many different things. So she's buried under one name, a brother's buried under a different name. Who knows? But again, she was very hard to find information on, so we don't even know when her parents passed away or what her last name was.
In 1887, a man named Joseph Pulitzer was living with his parents at 22 East 105th Street when he became acquainted with Annie. She was a sex worker at the time, spending most of her time in the Tenderloin. It started with her soliciting him for prostitution, and I don't know if he did, hire her in that way or not, but then it was just flirty conversation whenever they would cross paths. Joseph developed a true fondness for her, and he asked her to be his wife.
Quick vocabulary break. Several newspaper articles described Annie Pulitzer as a Tenderloin girl. At first glance, that sounds odd, but it wasn't referring to her personality or appearance. The Tenderloin was a notorious district of Manhattan known for prostitution, gambling, saloons, and other forms of vice. Around the turn of the 20th century, it had a reputation as New York City's red light district. So when reporters called Annie a Tenderloin girl, they were using a common newspaper shorthand to suggest that she was connected to that world, particularly prostitution.
Yeah, so Joseph Pulitzer fell in love with Annie, and she was quite beautiful. She'd originally been from Perth Amboy, New Jersey, and she was known for her beauty. A newspaper quote says,
"Up to the time she left here 7 years ago, she was the belle of Perth Amboy. Her beauty was remarkable. She was tall and blonde and superbly formed, a perfect type of Norse beauty."
Now, right here, I want to point out that she was actually 5'2". So if that's tall, then I am no longer short. Whatever Joseph did for a living wasn't entirely clear. The paper said he worked as a tailor with his brother, but the paper also said that Joseph's business in the Tenderloin had always been a mystery. So I'm not really sure what that meant. I mean, I guess he was there a lot and they didn't really understand why. In 1898, Annie and Joseph were married by Pastor Schneider, who was the marrying parson of 2nd Avenue. And then they moved to Philadelphia, where they lived on 15th Street near Filbert, and then they moved back to New York. And in New York, they lived at 7 different addresses, the most recent being 160 West 46th Street.
That is a lot of moving.
Yeah, and that was all in just 4 years. 8 different addresses in 4 years. Now, something that's very interesting is that Annie and Joseph used fake names when they rented homes. They were the Kingstons. Annie went by Lillian Kingston and Joseph went by George Kingston. Joseph had introduced Annie to his family as a former actress, and the family still didn't think this was a very honorable career, so they didn't approve.
Well, if only they knew what she really was doing for a living.
Yeah, I was surprised to see they frowned upon acting when obviously there are worse things. It was September 1st, 1902, when 26-year-old Annie Pulitzer and her husband Joseph moved into a boarding home owned by Mrs. Flemings. This was the 106 West 46th address, and this was to be their last home together. On Tuesday, September 16th, Joseph Pulitzer spent the day acting as a captain at the 27th Assembly District primaries for the Greater New York Democracy. This meant that he was working as a political organizer, helping people to get to the polls. He was handing out ballots, sometimes providing snacks to people who were waiting in line, and just other things like that. He was basically just working at the polls that day. He got home from all of that at 11 o'clock p.m. He'd been wearing shoes that were actually pretty new, and they were hurting his feet pretty bad because they hadn't been, broken in yet. So he got home and he was taking off his shoes and he said hello to his wife. Now, Annie told him that she'd had dinner earlier that evening at Mock's Restaurant, which was located on 42nd Street. And she said that when she left to come home, a strange man had accosted her on the street and he offered her a very large sum of money if she would go home with him. Now, she refused the offer, and then she and Joseph kind of laughed over the absurdity of the matter, and then the two of them decided to eat something. Annie told him that she'd make him a cup of hot cocoa, but then she realized they were actually out of hot cocoa. So Joseph said he'd, run out to get a box of cocoa, and she said that she would head, kind of in the other direction and stop at a bakery to pick up some cakes and rolls to go along with their cocoa. Now, before leaving the house, Annie removed a gold chatelaine watch and 4 rings, and she handed them to Joseph. She kept her wedding ring on, and she was wearing a pair of diamond earrings that were 3/4 carats each. So Joseph went to the store and he purchased the box of cocoa, and then he returned to the boarding house where they lived. He sat on the stairs to wait for Annie. He waited and waited. After an hour or so, he walked down to the bakery and asked if she had been there, and they said yes, she had. She had purchased 6 little cakes. He then went back home and he waited the rest of the night. On Wednesday morning, September 17th, Joseph went to the 57th Street court to ask if his wife had been arrested, and they didn't have any record of her being in custody at all.
So why would his first thought have been that she might have been arrested?
Well, there was just one article that mentioned that Joseph knew she would sometimes entertain the attentions of other men. And he also said that she'd been arrested for solicitation in the past, so he was checking to see if maybe that's what happened. He later went to police headquarters to tell them his wife was missing, and he gave them a description, and the police said they would keep an eye out. And then Joseph walked all over New York City asking if anyone had seen her. That's all he could do.
Candy! Thousands look forward to our Friday and Saturday sales. The reason for it is directly due to the fact that there is no vestige of unworthiness. That every price is as low as absolutely pure and reliable candies can be sold at. There is no exaggeration of qualities. Everything is precisely as represented. Special for Friday and Saturday. Butter peanut brittle, 10 cents a pound. Oriental fruit paste in orange and lemon, 12 cents a pound. Chocolate Mexican nut kisses, 19 cents a pound. We will deliver any or all of the above. Loft Candies, 54 Barclay Street.
While Joseph Pulitzer searched New York City for any sign of his missing wife, events were unfolding across the Hudson River in New Jersey. It was shortly before 1:00 p.m. on Thursday, September 18th, 1902. John Keller was sitting high on the driver's seat of a horse-drawn express wagon, reins in hand, heading over the Newark Plank Road toward Jersey City, with 1 or 2 horses pulling the vehicle. Keller worked for Brown's Express Company, located in Newark. It was the horse and buggy version of UPS. Newark Plank Road was a busy route that cut across the marshes between Newark and Jersey City. Beside the road, when it was in the township of Kearny, ran the Morris Canal. As Keller guided his horse along what was called Kearny Meadows, something near the canal bank caught his attention. The water was very low as it fluctuated with the tides. He could see something white just beneath the surface. By the time he'd driven out of sight of the object, he knew that he'd just seen a human body. He whipped his horses into a run and he drove them straight to the 4th Precinct station house to inform Chief Murphy. Meanwhile, another man came along that route of the Newark Plank Road. His name was David Powell, and he was a motorman who operated a trolley for the North Jersey Traction Company.
Newark Plank Road was a major transportation corridor crossing the marshy meadows, so there were multiple forms of transportation that shared the route. The trolley line ran along the plank roads as well.
When the trolley made it halfway between the Passaic and Hackensack rivers, Powell spotted the body just beneath the water down in the Morris Canal. He leaned over the gate of the trolley car to make sure that that was what he saw, and he knew that he was not mistaken. He couldn't stop the trolley car until it reached the west side of the bridge over Hackensack River, where an inspector winds up boarding every car. It was Inspector Walter Blair that day, and Powell told him immediately what he'd seen and exactly where he'd seen it. Then Powell continued on his route, while Blair sent someone to notify the Jersey City Police and Chief Murphy. By the time Chief Murphy got the report from the trolley inspector, he'd already heard from John F. Keller. So this kicked the police into high gear, and they went at once to this location. That particular part of the Morris Canal is actually known as the Cut, and it's about 25 feet in width and the inner bank is only about 15 feet from the rail of that traction company line. So on the trolley, he really was not far from the body. When the tide is high in the river, there's about 5 feet of water in the canal. When the tide is low in the rivers, there's just a 3-foot wide strip at the bottom of the canal that has any water in it, and that's just like a few inches deep. So the bottom of the canal, it's covered with thick, slimy black ooze, and no person could actually walk on it without sinking because it's just like sludge. So whoever put this body here clearly did not realize how low the water gets when the tide goes out. And I mean, it's truly impossible, they said, to hide anything in this canal because it's going to be exposed. Chief Murphy from Jersey City arrived at the location with a few men and promptly realized that this location was actually within the limits of Kearney Township, and it was outside the jurisdiction of the Jersey City Police. So they notified the Kearney officials, and they also notified Prosecutor James S. Irwin and County Physician Charles B. Converse. The county physician ordered the Jersey City morgue to take the body, so a wagon and 2 men were sent from the morgue to the location. When those men arrived, they were at a loss as to how they would even get her out of the water. It was impossible to walk out to her, being in the thick ooze. And at this time, there was more than a foot of water above her. So it was still very, very shallow, but there was some water. They could see that there was something tied around her waist. But aside from that, she was completely nude. Her body was face up, and her long golden hair was draped across her right shoulder. Finally, someone got a rope and they tied a 3-pound rock to one end. They threw the rock over the body and then they pulled the rope in, and the rock eventually kind of caught under her body, and it ultimately shifted her in a way that she was within reach from the side, and they were able to pull her out. Later in the afternoon, County Physician Charles B. Converse made a superficial examination of the body. She was 5'2". She was, quote, well-formed, and she weighed 120 pounds. Her hair was light gold, and it was 1.5 feet in length. Her eyes were gray with thick lashes, and she had a long, full nose and a rather large mouth with a thick bottom lip.
The face was more circular in shape than oval, and was filled out, as though the dead woman had been used to good living.
She had soft, well-shaped hands with long, slender fingers. Her feet were small and well-shaped. Her upper teeth were all missing, but the gums were perfectly fine, which meant that the teeth had been extracted a long time ago. The lower teeth were all in great condition, and they had found no false teeth at all anywhere along Plank Road, and they didn't see any in the mud at the bottom of the canal either. So if she had been wearing false teeth, they were not there. He said she'd been dead for about 2 days, but had likely only been in the water for 1. She had a severe bruise on the right side of her forehead, a bruise on her left cheek, and a 5-inch gash in the left side of her abdomen, right around the midline, running from left to right. Her intestines were protruding from this gash. The coroner decided at this time that the cause of death must have been a blow to the head, and the gash was inflicted after death because there was no hemorrhage. But later, he actually changed that. He said that the blow to the head wasn't serious. At first, they thought that her skull was fractured, but it was not. And he said that it was probably the gash that killed her, but it would have been a very slow death. A reporter asked him if the wound in the abdomen was unusual, or if he could tell with what instrument it had been made, and he replied,
"The wound is very unusual, and it is there. That is all."
What had been tied around her waist was a 3/4-inch wide leather strap, and some reports say it was 6.5 feet long, but others say it was 12 feet long, so I'm not exactly sure on how long it was. The strap had been so tightly wrapped around her that it left a mark where it had been compressed around her skin. Each end of the strap had a snap slip attached, and on one of these clips was attached a 20-pound carriage weight. It had the name of Covert Manufacturing Company on it in raised letters.
A carriage weight was a heavy iron weight that was used to keep a horse from wandering off when there wasn't a hitching post nearby. The driver would attach the weight to the horse's bridle or harness and drop it on the ground. The weight wasn't heavy enough to completely stop the horse from moving, but it was heavy enough to discourage it from wandering very far.
Within an hour or two, Prosecutor Irwin's office decided to take charge of the case, taking it away from the Kearney police. Then the prosecutor asked Chief of Police Benjamin F. Murphy from Jersey City to help him with it.
So Chief Murphy was glad to pass it off to Kearney, and then the prosecutor found a way to make him take it anyway?
Yes. And then Chief Murphy contacted the police over in New York, speaking to a Captain Titus, and he arranged for New York to assist them as well. A detective from New York was sent right over to the Jersey City morgue. Meanwhile, back in New York City, Joseph Pulitzer picked up a copy of the evening newspaper.
It's worth mentioning that newspapers worked a little differently back then. In a major city like New York, newspapers often published multiple editions throughout the day, with reporters rushing new information into print as quickly as they could. If a sensational murder case was unfolding, people might buy a morning paper, an afternoon edition, and an evening edition all on the same day just to keep up with the latest developments. In many ways, it was the early 20th century version of refreshing a news website or scrolling social media for updates.
Yeah, and if there was some huge breaking news, they'd even publish an extra edition to get the news out immediately.
Extra, read all about it, war is over.
And like Bugs Bunny, they go, extra, read all about it. Anyways, it makes sense now.
Yeah, I learned something new. So there's Joseph Pulitzer reading an evening edition. He sees that a woman's body has been found in Morris Canal, and she is as yet unidentified. He read the description of the body, the long golden hair, the gray eyes, the thick lower lip.
She was well-formed, her top teeth were missing.
Yes, all of that. And he thought it sounded like it might be his missing wife. He immediately made his way over to the Spears Morgue in Jersey City, and he took a young man with him by the name of Shields. I couldn't find a first name, but just Shields. So Shields actually was the stepson of the owner of that boarding rooming house where Joseph and Annie lived. When Joseph arrived at the morgue, Prosecutor James Irwin was already there with a few other detectives, and it was right around 9:25 p.m. Joseph and Shields were taken into the room with the body. She was covered only by a sheet, and her body was lying in an icebox. When the county physician pulled the sheet back from her face, Joseph cried,
"My God, it is she!"
He collapsed, and Shields caught him. He was then taken into a private office, and he was just overcome by emotion while they interviewed him. Joseph was questioned at the morgue for more than 2 hours, and while this was taking place, a large crowd had gathered out front, and at midnight, Chief Murphy opened the doors to make a statement. He read Joseph Pulitzer's statement about when he and Annie met, what Joseph did for business, and what happened on the day that she went missing. He was taken into custody because they believed now that it was most likely a lover's quarrel and Joseph probably killed her. Chief Murphy and the New York detectives were just trying to establish a motive at that point so they could really stick it to Joseph. They took him to talk to Captain Titus in New York City, and after that, Joseph was taken by 2 officers to look for this mysterious male visitor that someone said had come to the home to visit Annie earlier on the day she went missing. And it turns out that that mysterious male visitor had sold her a watch, and she had been making payments, but she hadn't paid in a few months, so he was just coming trying to look for money. Now, Joseph was taken into custody. Chief Murphy from Jersey City decided that the weight and the leather strap were probably going to be the key to solving this crime. These items would undoubtedly be identified by their owner. Murphy was sure that Joseph was guilty, and they just needed to find a liveryman to confirm that Joseph had rented a rig from him to take the body out to the Morris Canal. Captain Titus from New York, as well as all the other lawmen, thought they had for sure caught Joseph in a lie. Joseph said that she'd taken off her jewelry before leaving the house that night, and Chief Murphy told the papers that Annie was, quote, a creature of the street, and that
Women of her class are proud of their jewelry and seldom, if ever, remove it.
I mean, what?
Detective Jack Graham and Prosecutor Irwin went to the place where the body was found, and they located something that seemed like a very strong piece of evidence. There was a small election diamond card which said, quote, "Vote for W.S. Devery for leader." So this seemed like more evidence pointing at Joseph Pulitzer since he had been working at the polls on the day she went missing. While they attempted to build a case against Joseph Pulitzer, Chief Murphy had a few officers going around to every single livery stable to ask about the weight and the strap. A reporter for the Evening Journal was keeping up with the whole investigation, and he decided to visit a few livery stables as well. He walked into the livery stable owned by Charles T. Evans at 151 Washington Street in Hoboken, New Jersey. Evans had not even heard about a body being found, so the reporter told him all about it. And he mentioned the 20-pound carriage weight as well as the long leather strap, and suddenly a light bulb went off in the liveryman's head. He'd had the most unusual experience just the day before. It was Wednesday evening, September 17th, when a stranger came into the livery stable, and he said,
"How are you, Mr. Evans? You remember me, don't you? I used to be with the Crusader."
He went on to say that he needed to rent a rig just for a couple hours, and it needed to be a big one because he had a trunk he had to move. He was told it would be $2 for 2 hours, and he handed over the cash.
And for those of you who think $2 is a steal, back in 1902, it had the purchasing power of about $77.45.
2 hours later, the rig was not returned. Hours upon hours went by, and Mr. Evans finally contacted the police to report the horse and buggy stolen. The police were now on the lookout. Then, Thursday morning, September 18th, here comes the rig at 8 o'clock a.m. Mr. Evans told the man,
"You came near being arrested. I notified the police that my horse and buggy were missing, and they are looking for you. You were lucky to get back before they noticed you."
The mystery man seemed to become very nervous after this remark, and he wanted to leave. But Evans wanted to know about payment for the remaining hours that the rig had been gone. The man said he didn't have the money on him, but he would be back a little later and he would pay him in full. And then the man practically ran out of the stable, never to be seen again. Evans obviously noticed that a lot of things were weird about this man, and one more seemingly inconsequential detail was that he'd been dressed very shabbily when he rented the rig the night before, but he was dressed to the nines in a fancy black suit when he returned it. Mr. Evans told all of this to the reporter, and then he said that he hadn't even thought about it until just now, but the man had insisted on having a carriage weight. Mr. Evans told him that this particular horse was slightly crippled and he really wouldn't need one, but the man insisted. And now that Mr. Evans thought about it, there were neither weight nor strap in the buggy when it was returned. The reporter got word to the police in Jersey City, who had the carriage weight with them. They sent a detective over to the livery stable in Hoboken, and the carriage weight was positively identified as belonging to Charles Evans. Once it was confirmed, and they'd found the horse and buggy that had been used to move the body of Annie Pulitzer, they just needed to find the guy. Well, Hooper Young's old friend and business partner, Dixie Anser, was following the case like nearly every other New Yorker. When he heard that they had found the rig that had transported the body and it had been returned to the livery stable around 8 o'clock Thursday morning, Dixie had a sinking feeling. He contacted Chief Donovan of the Hoboken Police Department and said,
"Shortly after 7 Thursday morning, Hooper Young came to my home on 7th Street and said he was going to return a hired rig to Charles K. Evans' livery stable. He had the rig with him at the time."
Chief Donovan had obviously heard about the hiring of a buggy by a stranger, so he and Dixie Anser headed over to the livery stable with a photograph. Mr. Evans looked at every face in the group photo, and finally he said,
"That's the man that hired my rig. I'd know him in 1,000. That's the fella, all right."
He was indeed pointing at Hooper Young. Chief Murphy in Jersey City was contacted, and then Captain Titus in New York was contacted. Dixie Anser knew that 31-year-old Hooper had been working for a man named Mac Levy at a Turkish bath and gymnasium located at 63 Clark Street. All of this information was given to the police, and within no time, they had the address where Hooper Young was living. Detective Donovan from Hoboken, as well as New York detectives, went and located the apartment. Then they informed the police at the West 47th station. When Captain Schmidberger heard of the discovery, he went straight over there with detectives Bonoyle and Lohmeyer. Captain Schmidberger forced his way into the door of the luxurious apartment, and right before them, right in front of their eyes, was the crime scene. There were only 2 sheets on the bed, the rest of the bedding was missing, and these sheets were both blood-stained. There was a shallow closet just 3 feet away from the bed that had blood all over the bottom of the floor. There were 5 empty beer bottles, an empty whiskey bottle, and a partially empty bottle of knockout drops over on the washstand. Now, just to be clear, chloral hydrate was actually prescribed to a lot of people for help sleeping. So the presence of that partially empty bottle all by itself was not proof that any crime had been committed, but it was something to take note of because it was also known as knockout drops. There were some men's clothes found hanging in the kitchen after having been washed. The floor had obviously been scrubbed recently because it was still wet in several places. They found a lot of letters addressed to Hooper Young in the bedroom and the parlor. It took them 31 hours from the time the body was found to finding the scene of the crime and identifying their suspect. Just 31 hours. Through a lot of interviewing, it was learned that Hooper Young had purchased a large steerage steamer trunk on Wednesday morning, which was the day after Annie Pulitzer was last seen. This trunk was 4 feet high with wooden slats running lengthwise on top and bottom. He had paid $4 for the trunk, and he said his name was Young. The trunk dealer, William Canning, had his son, William Jr., take the trunk to 103 West 58th Street in a wheelbarrow. And then he helped Hooper carry the trunk upstairs. It was apparently very heavy. Being 4 feet high, that is huge. And I kind of wish I had one. But anyway, so he helps him carry the trunk upstairs, but Hooper wouldn't allow him to go into the apartment, which obviously we know why. Now, Hooper tipped him with a nickel, and William said to him,
"You're a cheapskate. Take back your nickel and keep it."
Hooper saw one of the building's bellboys, Albert Dolby, and told him, hey, later I'm going to need help moving a trunk downstairs, so heads up. So when Hooper got back from renting the rig, which happened at 6:30 p.m. or so, he called for Albert and told him that the trunk was ready to move. Albert said that the trunk was incredibly heavy, and when he made a comment about it, Hooper told him it was just full of old books. And Albert even said that as they were carrying it downstairs, he felt the weight inside shift. So it obviously wasn't packed full of books. There was some open room there. They carefully got the trunk down the stairs. They set it on the sidewalk for a bit, and then after a moment, when everything was ready, they picked it up again together and got it into the rear of the buggy. Now, even though Hooper had rented a larger buggy, it was still too small for the trunk. So the trunk was actually hanging off the back. I mean, this was a gigantic trunk. And again, I'm so jealous. It just sounds so cool. Anyway, Hooper took a rope from underneath the buggy and he tied the trunk in place so it couldn't fall off. And then off he went, driving like a madman down Broadway. Several people saw him almost collide with other buggies and even a trolley at one point. The buggy was swinging from side to side, and at least one witness said it looked like that trunk was going to fall off. He made a comment to a person who owned the store next to him and was like, "Do you see that? That's not going to make it far." Now, after dumping the body in the canal, he must have gone somewhere to go to sleep in the buggy, that's my guess, because we never do find out what he did that night. Early in the morning, he took the buggy over to his friend Dixie Anser's place and asked if he wanted to go for a ride real quick before he returned the rig. So Dixie got in, and they rode around for about half an hour, and then Hooper returned the rig to Mr. Evans's livery stable at about 8 o'clock a.m. Thursday morning. Nobody knows what he did that day from 8 o'clock in the morning on Thursday, because he actually wasn't seen again at his home until Thursday night at 8 p.m. So for 12 hours, they have no idea where he was or what he was doing. He had gotten the trunk back to the Clarence apartments at some point because he asked Albert Dolby to help him get the empty trunk back up the stairs. And then he filled it with clothes and other items, and then he asked Dolby to help him carry the trunk all the way to the Wells Fargo to have this trunk shipped somewhere. And when he addressed it, he put the name Charles S. Eiling, like he was shipping it to Charles S. Eiling. And at first he wanted to ship it to Philadelphia, but Wells Fargo said that they didn't actually ship to that location. So he said Chicago would be, just fine. Then he and Dolby went back to the Clarence apartments. He went into his apartment, and then he came out later with 2 bundles, one under each arm, and then he went away. After that, he was just gone. And now they had to find him.
Cure for pimples. A sluggish condition of the stomach, bowels, liver, kidneys, and bladder, as well as the uterine function, is often the cause of facial eruptions, which the Cuticura resolvent pills readily correct. While clogging of the pores or sebaceous glands is prevented by Cuticura soap and hot water. Gently smear the face with Cuticura ointment, but do not rub. Wash off the ointment in 5 minutes with Cuticura soap and hot water, and bathe freely for some minutes. Repeat this treatment morning and evening. Use Cuticura soap alone with hot water at other times as often as agreeable. Cuticura, sold throughout the world.
On Friday, September 19th, the name Hooper Young was on the front page of every newspaper. The search quickly spread beyond New York City. Newspapers throughout the region published Hooper's photograph and description, and tips began pouring in. Witnesses reported seeing him in various places, but figuring out which tips were legitimate was very difficult. There were supposed sightings of Hooper Young all over the place. The papers would publish things like, "They have him cornered in New Jersey. An arrest is imminent," but he really wasn't anywhere near there. One witness later recalled seeing him at a barber shop in Danbury about 7 o'clock in the morning on Friday, September 19th. And there he dramatically altered his appearance by shaving off his distinctive black mustache and then changing his hairstyle. He also purchased a pair of overalls, and he began traveling on foot toward Brookfield and eventually Derby, Connecticut. For several days, the fugitive remained frustratingly elusive. Not only had he altered his appearance, but he was now living as a hobo. What police could not have known was that Hooper seemed unable to resist following news of the case. Even while on the run, he would go into stores to find newspapers and read every available account of the investigation. Now, his father, over in Paris, was contacted, and he learned that not only was his son living at his house, but that he was accused of a most heinous crime and was on the run. So his father sent a telegram to one of his associates in New York on September 21st, and he asked him to make sure it was published in the paper. It read,
To William Hooper Young, I hear you are suspected of a heinous crime and being sought for. I advise you to surrender to the officers of the law, facing the charge like a man. I have engaged counsel for your defense. No one knowing you can believe you guilty. You owe it to yourself, your family, and the religion you forsook to prove your innocence. If you will take this course, we will stand by you. John W. Young.
The arrest finally came on September 21st, that same day that this telegram was published. A man had entered the grocery store of El Coulette in a village called Stevenson, which is located about 5 miles north of Derby, Connecticut. The man was wearing overalls, and he was clearly intoxicated. He asked to see the New York newspapers, and while he was reading all of the articles about the search for Hooper Young, the groceryman was struck by how much he resembled those pictures. As soon as the man left, Mr. Coulette telephoned the police in Derby. Officers Robert Pierce and Louis Knapp, who were wearing plain clothes, they were sent out in that direction, and they met up with this man just 3 miles outside of the village. They went past him first, and then they turned around, and stopped him in his tracks. They offered him a drink of whiskey, and as he reached for the bottle, they pulled out their revolvers and attempted to take him into custody. But Hooper put up a big fight, and they had to beat him before he would submit to arrest.
Or maybe they just beat him because that's what cops did back then, and sometimes still do.
That's kind of what I was thinking. However, they said later that he was actually a lot bigger and stronger than the papers had made him out to be. When he got to the station, he was a nervous wreck. He was officially charged with vagrancy so that they could hold him in jail. And again, he was completely intoxicated. He was clearly freaking out, and he begged for whiskey and cigarettes. When he was searched, they found that his pockets were filled with cayenne pepper. The newspaper says that he admitted that the pepper was there to prevent arrest, but later the newspaper said that he explained that the cayenne pepper helped to settle his stomach when he was coming off of a drunken bender. So he always had cayenne pepper in his pockets. Now, I Googled this. I was curious about this. Is that actually a cure for a hangover? And it said that it used to be one of these popular ideas. People thought it was a cure, but it really wasn't. But cayenne pepper is a natural pain reliever. And so if people take it, a pinch of it in a glass of water, apparently it just helps them feel less terrible while their body is recovering. The police took note of his physical appearance. He was 5'8", 35 years old, according to the stranger. However, he was actually 31. He was sallow-skinned, clean-shaven. His fingers were stained, which showed that he was a regular smoker, and one of his front teeth on the right side of his upper jaw had recently been pulled. He would only say that his name was Bert Edwards and that he had been homeless out of Oregon for the last 6 years. He said that he had decided to become a tramp and, live this tramp lifestyle because of a disappointment over a love affair that he had had. He absolutely denied being Hooper Young or having any knowledge of the murder. When Captain Titus in New York was informed that they may have Young in custody, he brushed it off and said it couldn't possibly be Hooper Young because Hooper didn't have a missing tooth. The police in Derby were pretty darn sure this was Hooper Young, though. They started looking into his story and finding piece after piece to be untrue. For example, the man in custody said that he'd never been to New York, and yet his coat had a Fishman and Fisher tag, which was a store located on Broadway. So, like I said, Captain Titus in New York was thinking there's no way this could be Hooper Young. He wasn't at all interested in even entertaining the idea, because remember, he's had so many false leads already. But then, something really pivotal took place. On Monday morning, September 22nd, 1902, one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case arrived back in New York City. You may remember that after Annie's murder, Hooper Young had shipped a large steamer trunk to Chicago. Once police connected the trunk to the investigation, Chicago authorities seized it and they sent it back east. At 9 o'clock that morning, Assistant District Attorney Garvin and Captain Titus opened the trunk and carefully examined its contents. All of the detectives who had been working on the case were also there, as were newspaper reporters and photographers. And we do have a really cool picture of all of the contents laid out on a table. So it's pretty cool. Now, inside the trunk, they found a disturbing collection of items, and many of them were stained with blood. Most notably were a Chinese knife. They called it a Chinese dirk. It was 8 inches long, and it had an imitation ivory handle that was carved with Chinese characters and scrolls. There was a paper bag containing cakes and rolls, which Annie had just purchased before her murder. There was a set of false upper teeth with one tooth broken off. That tooth was actually found at the bottom of the trunk. A black silk skirt was in the trunk. It was covered with blood. There was a man's checked coat and vest. Now, both of them were wet, and they had apparently been washed, and it looked as though they'd actually been used to mop up blood from the floor. And in the right pocket of the coat was a large amount of cayenne pepper. A blonde switch of hair was also in there. This was like a hairpiece to add length or fullness to a woman's hairdo. And there were 2 receipts from pawn shops. Alongside these were numerous articles of Annie's clothing, a lot of it being ripped and torn. The missing bedding from the apartment was also in the trunk. There was 1 pair of women's shoes, 2 pairs of men's shoes, rope, twine, and other blood-stained items. So this was a lot of evidence that matched up with everything that they had so far. The cakes and rolls matched those Annie had purchased shortly before she disappeared. I mean, that's why she left the house. The false teeth were undoubtedly hers, because she had no teeth on the top. And the blood-stained clothing and personal effects belonging to both Annie and Hooper Young tied the trunk directly to the crime. The trunk and everything in it became one of the most important exhibits in the case against Hooper Young. While the police were going through this treasure trove of evidence, something else was happening. At 9:45 that same morning, Annie Pulitzer's casket left the morgue. Drawn by a single black horse, the covered morgue wagon made its way through the streets of New York toward the Pennsylvania Railroad station, where her body would begin its final journey home. Later on that same Monday, September 22nd, Chief of Detectives Captain Titus of New York City received a message from Chief of Police Arnold of Danbury, Connecticut, saying that the authorities over in Derby, they're pretty sure that the man they have in custody is Hooper Young, but Chief Arnold himself was just certain that they were wrong. And he basically told Captain Titus, don't waste your time. They'll figure it out and let him go. But now Captain Titus had found one little clue that was very compelling and strongly pointed at the stranger in Derby as their man. The man in custody had cayenne pepper in his pockets, and inside the trunk they found one of Hooper's coats with cayenne pepper inside of the right pocket. How many people walk around with a large supply of cayenne pepper in their pockets?
I mean, probably not a whole lot.
Probably not a whole lot. Yeah, I can't imagine many people aside from Hooper Young walked around with cayenne pepper on hand 24/7. And Captain Titus felt the same way. He ignored what Chief Arnold had sent him, and Titus sent Detective Sergeant Frank A. Finley and a man named Gustav Ernst straight to Derby, Connecticut to attempt a positive identification. Gustav Ernst was a commercial artist that worked at 63 and 65 Clark Street in Brooklyn. He'd been employed to create signage and other advertising materials at the Physical Culture School owned and operated by a man named Mac Levy. Hooper Young had most recently been working there as well as an envelope stuffer for mailing circulars. Hooper had only worked there for the past 2 or 3 weeks.
Around the turn of the 20th century, physical culture was a popular movement that promoted exercise, strength training, good posture, healthy living, and overall physical fitness. Physical culture schools were part gymnasiums, part health club, and part social gathering place. They offered exercise classes, weight training, wrestling instruction, and sometimes even lectures on health and nutrition. Long before modern fitness centers became common, these schools attracted people interested in building strength and improving their health. So when you read that someone worked at or was associated with a physical culture school, think of something similar to an early gym, which is basically what it was.
Now, Gustav knew Hooper pretty well. I mean, he'd seen him enough that he knew exactly who he was, and he would be able to identify him. Gustav said that the last time he'd seen Hooper in New York, it was the Thursday that the wagon had been returned to the livery stable. He really took notice of him as he walked down the street because he was dressed up super fancy, and he typically dressed in, very shabby casual clothes. So he was wearing a black broadcloth suit, black hat, black tie, and black patent leather shoes. Gustav said that the last person at the physical culture school to have spoken to Hooper was probably Little Willie, a young boy who was employed to rub men.
That's gross. I feel like my face is reacting more than my voice. Nasty.
Yeah. So, Yeah, it sounds pretty creepy. And apparently he was the boy that rubbed him every day. It's like,
No.
yeah. So I think they meant massages, but still, it's so very creepy. And I have no idea how old Willie was, but I mean, he's called Little Willie, and they referred to him as the boy who rubbed him daily. So, kind of weird. Anyway, apparently, Little Willie noticed that Hooper was dressed all in black, and he asked him if he was in mourning because, it was kind of the tradition came to us from Victorian England, right? That when someone dies, you dress all in black for a long period of time. But anyway, so Hooper said yes. That is why he was wearing that. Apparently, the super fancy suit was the only thing he had that was all black. So when Gustav stood before the stranger in the Derby jail, shortly after 2 o'clock that afternoon, he was pretty convinced that it was Hooper Young, though he wouldn't say that he was 100% positive because the charge was so serious. The man standing before him didn't have a mustache, and he had a different haircut. And he noted, the eyes are the same, the creases on either side of the nose are the same. And finally, they made him speak. They made, the man speak. And that's when Gustav was like, oh yeah, that's absolutely Hooper Young. But he told the officers he really wanted them to have other people identify him as well, because he would feel horrible if this man was, executed based just on his identification. And so they did seek to have more people come over to identify him. Detective Finley sent word to Captain Titus that they should send someone who knew Hooper even better and for a longer period of time. So Captain Titus was able to get Mac Levy, who owned the physical culture school and who had been Hooper's private physical culture tutor prior to hiring him as part of his staff. Mac Levy was brought to Derby by Detective Hughes, and they got to Derby around 6:20 p.m. They were in the jail corridor along with Detective Finley. The man who they had in custody in Derby was very nervous when he walked out into the corridor. Mac Levy looked at him just for a short time and then said,
"Hello, Hooper."
There was no response and no sign of recognition, so Mac said it again. Finally, the man calmly said,
"I don't know you." "Of course you know me."
Mac put his hand on one of his shoulders and spoke to him quietly for a couple minutes. Then the prisoner raised his voice and said,
"You should be sure of your identification. This is a terrible crime for which I'm held."
Then one of the officers told Young to take off his clothes so Mac might be able to complete his identification. I think since, they had worked together at a physical culture school, he probably had seen him with less clothes on. I don't know. But they took him to his cell before he could finish, so he didn't have to fully undress. Mac Levy and Detective Hughes stood at his cell door, and then that's when the officer told the prisoner formally what he was being charged with. Mac looked at him again and said,
"Hooper, it is hard for me to do this, but I must tell these gentlemen who you are. You might as well save me the trouble of identifying you, for I know you, and the fact that your mustache has been shaved off does not fool me at all."
The inmate looked over Mac's shoulder and saw Dixie Anzer standing in the corridor. Some articles say that Anzer was actually crying, while others just say he had, a pained look on his face. The prisoner looked back at Mac Levy, and his whole body began to shake. He started sweating profusely. One article actually said that sweat was dripping off of his fingertips, which seems weird, but anyway. So he started sweating. He was just really, really starting to freak out. His hands had kind of been up at his sides, maybe on his waist, but they just dropped down to his sides, and he lowered his head and he leaned against the open cell door. And it says that he stood like that for about 30 seconds, looking really defeated. And then he looked back up at Mac Levy. And again, he said,
"You say I'm young? Are you sure of this? Can you look me in the face and say that? Remember, this is a grave charge that has been made against me. Use calm judgment." "Tell the truth, Hooper, tell the truth." "Come in the cell, Mac. I want to talk to you."
Mac Levy and Hooper Young were alone in the cell for an hour. And during that time, Hooper made a complete confession to him. A few minutes after their talk was over, he repeated the confession to Detectives Hughes and Finley of New York, as well as Chief Arnold of Danbury. He had left New York on Saturday, September 20th, he said. He followed railroad tracks. On Sunday night, he slept in a barn. He picked up meals wherever he could get them. He drank whiskey whenever he could find it. And he said that on Sunday, September 21st, he'd drunk almost 2 whole quarts of whiskey. As for the crime itself, he told a very interesting tale. He said that he had not killed her, of course. He said that he'd met a man named Charles Simpson Eiling in Central Park about a month prior, and they would hang out from time to time. He said that it was Charles Eiling who introduced Hooper to Annie Pulitzer, and that he had not met her prior to that night. He said that they'd actually met up with her by appointment that night, that the meeting had been planned in advance. Hooper, Eiling, and Annie met up at Broadway and 46th. The 3 of them took a taxi and went into Hooper's apartments in the Clarence apartment house. At one point, Hooper says that he left to go get some whiskey, and when he came back, he found that Eiling wasn't there, and Annie was lying across the bed with a gag in her mouth, and she wasn't breathing. Hooper said that he ripped her clothes open. He waved her hands over her head, trying to get her to breathe. He said that he put his hand under her shirt to feel her heart, and he couldn't feel it beating. So he decided he had to contact the police. He says he went outside and walked around looking for a police officer. He didn't see one, so he decided he'd have to get on a trolley and go to police headquarters, which he thought was by City Hall. So he got on a trolley, he's heading toward downtown, and while he was in the trolley car, he got to thinking about what a disgrace this whole thing would bring upon him and his father. So he decided he ought to just hide the body instead. So he got off the train and he headed back to his apartment at 103 West 58th Street. He said he figured he ought to cut up the body to more easily dispose of it. So he took his Chinese knife with that 8-inch blade and he made a cut in her abdomen. He said the stench was so bad that he decided not to continue. Now, the authorities said that's absolutely ridiculous because she'd only been dead about an hour if his story were true, so she would not have smelled bad yet. But he wasn't saying that it smelled bad from death, right? He was just saying it smelled bad cutting into her abdomen. So I Googled this wondering, like, is there a smell, right? And it said that depending on, it said even during surgery, a person who is alive and healthy, there can be some unpleasant odors, when they cut into the abdominal cavity, especially if he were to have nicked part of the intestines, then for sure, that would have created a really bad smell. So I don't think that he was meaning that she smelled like she was decomposing, but maybe he was lying and he actually tried to cut her up the next day. I don't know. So anyway, he decided not to continue with dismemberment. So instead, he removed her diamond earrings and her ring, and then he put her body into the shallow closet in his room while he tried to figure out what to do. Now, there was a lot of blood, keep in mind, a lot of blood all on the floor there. So that says to me, and I am not an expert in this, so I could be completely wrong. I just want to say that right now. But that says to me that maybe her heart was still beating for the blood to come out. You know what I mean? Like all over the floor. And because it said earlier when they went into his apartment, the floor was wet and it had been scrubbed, and it didn't specify that it was just the floor in the closet. It made me think it was the kitchen because they said that after mentioning the clothes that were hanging in the kitchen. And also a pair of his pants that they found in the trunk, they could see that, he had washed it. The stuff that he washed, he just threw into it wet. So they knew he'd washed it, but there were blood stains on the knees. So he was down on his knees on the floor in blood, mopping up blood with other clothes. He must not have had a mop. Because his dad had hired staff, so his dad certainly didn't mop himself. I don't know. Anyway, so yeah, I feel like with that amount of blood all over the sheets, blood all over the bedding that was in the trunk, blood all over the floor, blood on the bottom of the closet, It sounds to me like she probably wasn't dead when he made that cut into her abdomen. And I mean, it was so deep and 5 inches long that when they found her, her intestines were coming out. So pretty serious. Yeah. Anyway, by the time he stuffed her body in that closet, it was very early Wednesday morning, September 17th. He admitted to buying the trunk, renting the rig, and dumping the body in the Morris Canal. He was not denying that at all. He even admitted to having pawned her diamond earrings for $8.50, and the police said like that was so messed up because they were worth $150 because apparently they were super fancy. But he steadfastly denied having been the one who took Annie's life. He said that he and Charles Eiling left New York together after dumping the body, and they remained together for a couple days. But all of the witnesses who had seen Hooper Young during any of this swore that there was no other man. They even found the cab driver who drove Hooper and Annie to the Clarence apartment house that night, and there simply was no other man. The police believed he was just making it up and that Charles Eiling did not exist. Hooper's father had retained a defense attorney by the name of William Hart. He was notified that Hooper Young was indeed the man in custody in Derby, Connecticut, and Mr. Hart began his trek over there immediately. He arrived around 2 a.m. on Tuesday, September 23rd. A bit later that morning, they began the trip, to move Hooper Young back to New York City. Now, there was a large crowd gathered outside of the jail doors in Derby because news had spread, and they wanted to catch a glimpse of this murderer. They yelled and jeered as he went past. They made their trip back to New York in a smoking car on the train. Hooper and Detective Finley sat together in a forward-facing seat. I believe they were handcuffed to each other. And Detective Hughes and Attorney Hart sat opposite them in the backward-facing seat. The train had to make 3 stops on the way to New York City. At every stop, random people entered the car to stare at him, which seems crazy. And so after a while, he just held up his newspaper to hide his face. But yeah, I mean, so weird. It's just not like that today. Sometime during the trip, he was offered a cigarette, but he said no.
Those are the things which put my brain to the bad. I'm done with them. I'm going to be different after this and quit on rum and cigarettes.
He then turned to Detective Finley and asked him to get him a package of a well-known cure for the tobacco habit.
Gentlemen, have you become a slave to the poisonous tobacco weed? Do your nerves tremble? Has your vitality fled? Are you smoking yourself into eternity? Then try the miracle cure that has America talking. No tobacco. That's right. No tobacco has already cured hundreds of thousands of tobacco users nationwide. One satisfied customer gained 11 pounds in 15 days. Another gained 20 pounds in 30 days. And one grateful gentleman declared that no tobacco restored not only his health, but his happiness as well. In fact, one delighted user was so pleased with the results that he and his wife named their newborn baby after the man who wrote the slogan, "Don't tobacco spit and smoke your life away." Friends, can your cigarette do that? Ask your druggist for no tobacco today. If it fails to cure you, your money will be refunded. But it won't, because it's a miracle.
The train finally arrived at Grand Central Station at 9:21 a.m., and there were about 1,000 people gathered at the gate hoping to catch a glimpse. They didn't know exactly which train he'd be on, so they all rushed closer any time a train came in. When Hooper saw the crowd, he was terrified. I mean, lynchings weren't a thing of the past, right? So his fear was valid. When the gates were opening, his anxiety rose even higher. He looked around for Attorney Hart and didn't see him.
Mr. Hart! Mr. Hart!
The detectives refused to take Hooper through those gates when they saw the giant, eager mob. So they ordered the police officers that were present to clear a path, and even some station employees, jumped in to help as well. So they were able to make a split right through the middle of the mob, and then Hooper was rushed through. So Detective Finley, being handcuffed to Hooper, was dragging Hooper forward through this column, and Detective Hughes had his hand on Hooper's back to urge him to move faster. So they are just rushing him right down to get to the road to the wagon. Now, when they got to the street, Attorney Hart was still missing, and Hooper called out for him again. He was loaded into the carriage, and after a while, Mr. Hart was able to get through the crowd and climbed in. They drove to the Mott Street entrance of police headquarters, and more than 300 people were on the street to see them. The paper said that every single employee at the police station was actually out on the street, to be there to watch him arrive. Now, this time, Detective Hughes made sure Mr. Hart did not get separated from them again. So Hughes grabbed Mr. Hart by the arm, and he wound up escorting him into the building. And then Finley, who was still handcuffed to Hooper, obviously took care of him and got him inside. So they get inside the main corridor of police headquarters, and then they had to turn into this narrow hallway leading down to the detective bureau. And at that point, Hooper again lost sight of Mr. Hart. Now, Hart had somehow been pushed to the rear. It said in the paper he was a small man, so naturally he would just be pushed to the back. So Hooper, when he realized he didn't see his attorney, he just stopped. He just planted his feet and asked,
"Where's Hart? Where's Hart?"
Someone from the back shouted, "He's coming!" Hooper was first taken to the Rogues Gallery to have his photo taken. So that was their mugshots. And then he and Hart were both pushed into Captain Titus's office. And this is when he was officially questioned by Captain Titus before being sent to his new cell in Hospital Row at the Tombs. Also that day, Tuesday, September 23rd, 1902, Annie Pulitzer's funeral was held in Perth Amboy, New Jersey. The funeral services began at her family's home on Smith Street at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. There was a large Danish population there in Perth Amboy. Her dad and many of the people there were actually from Denmark. So the service was held in both English and Danish with 2 different Danish reverends. Her mother was there, as well as 2 of her brothers, Peter and Anton. And then her casket was lowered into the grave in Alpine Cemetery at 3:15 p.m. Unfortunately, Annie's father was overseas in Denmark. He wouldn't be home until Christmas, and he wasn't even aware that his only daughter was dead. On the following day, Wednesday, September 24th, attorney William Hart made a statement in regards to the confession that had been made by Hooper Young.
"I have just listened to the most marvelous story I have ever heard in my life. If this man was sane, if he is in his right senses now, I do not know what to think of the story he has told me. It seems the story of a madman. Really, it was astounding. I want to have an expert on sanity see him before I begin actual work on the case."
Needless to say, Attorney Hart was convinced of Hooper's insanity. He wouldn't say whether or not he believed that Charles Eiling was a real person, but he believed that the story that he told, all by itself, just the story, showed that Hooper Young was insane.
One of the more controversial ideas discussed after they knew Hooper Young was their man was something called blood atonement. In the 19th century, some Mormon leaders taught that certain, especially serious sins, were so severe that forgiveness could require the sinner's own blood to be shed and spilled upon the ground. By 1903, the doctrine was already controversial and not something practiced by the church. Still, because Hooper Young was Brigham Young's grandson, newspapers and attorneys spent a great deal of time debating whether blood atonement had anything to do with Annie Pulitzer's death. No evidence was ever found that it did.
Right, and in fact, neither the defense nor the prosecution had any intention of even bringing blood atonement into the trial. It was 100% just created and circulated in the newspapers to create sensationalism. The DA was District Attorney Jerome. He had 2 assistant district attorneys. There was ADA Clark and ADA Steuben. Now, normally back then, these cases went very quickly from arrest to trial, right? It would be 2 weeks or something. But in this one, they actually took a little more time to build their case. And it didn't actually go to trial until February of 1903, almost 5 months later. And the strangest thing happened. By the time trial got close, several of the witnesses disappeared. Now, Joseph Pulitzer disappeared as the trial approached, okay? Joseph Pulitzer, that is her husband. He was the last person to see her alive. He's a very, very significant witness, but he was gone. Mac Levy also disappeared. Dixie Anzer goes missing as well. All of these guys were supposed to testify in the trial. Mac Levy was eventually located in Georgia, and I'm not sure if they ever did find Dixie Anzer, and they never ever located Joseph Pulitzer. So, funny story, when they were picking the jury, they asked if they knew anyone who was involved in the case. And so one of the potential jurors actually said that he knew Joseph. You know, he hadn't seen him in a long time, but a friend of his in Michigan had seen him like a week ago, and that Joseph Pulitzer told this guy's friend that he was avoiding New York because he didn't want to testify in the trial. So at least we know he wasn't abducted, but the newspapers thought that maybe the Mormon church was abducting these witnesses to help Hooper's case. Like, it was crazy what they were saying in the papers. The trial began on Wednesday, February 4th, 1903. At this stage, you know, they're just trying to secure a jury of 12. Hooper hadn't been doing very well, like health-wise. He was a completely nervous wreck, and he was getting worse as the trial date approached. And they pointed out that when he was first arrested, he was first put in there, he was calm, he was fine, he smoked pipes and cigars all day, he would read papers. The other inmates wouldn't talk to him, but he didn't care, and he was just doing fine. He was calm as a cucumber. But then, as the date approached for the trial, he just started to like really, really get nervous about it. And so on the morning of February 4th, Attorney Hart showed up, you know, when court was supposed to start, but he did not have Hooper with him. And Attorney Hart was asking if they could, you know, postpone this whole thing. He said his client was not doing well. Well, the judge disagreed with that. He was like, we're not postponing. And he ordered Hooper to appear. So Hooper Young was carried into the courtroom on a chair, completely limp. Like, two guys had to like carry him in. His head was hanging over, his arms were just dangling. So they brought in doctors to examine him, and they decided, you know, physically he's perfectly fine. He's able to proceed. Like, this isn't going to damage his physical health. But in that time, remember, this is like about 5 months, his hair had not been cut. His face had not been shaved. So, I mean, he's got this long, scraggly, dirty beard, and his hair is just like gross and greasy. He had actually lost 30 pounds in that time. And he looked terrible. But, you know, the defendant was present. Now, he wasn't unconscious, though he might have looked that way when he came in. But he called,
Your Honor,
and raised his right hand, pointing at the judge. With his left hand, he was trying to hold his head steady because his head had been like rolling from side to side.
I have something to say to you. I have a right to speak. I'm not insane.
He'd been trying to stand, and he was forced back into his chair by Deputy Sheriff Van Deesten. He struggled more, again, like trying to get up and still demanding the right to speak. Well, it was Judge D. Katie Herrick who was presiding, and he looked at Hooper, right? He sees this. Like, I mean, this is insane. And then he ordered D.A. Jerome and Attorney Hart to approach the bench. Now, ultimately, they argued about it, but they finally agreed to have him examined by some experts before proceeding. The examination began at 2 p.m. that day, and it was conducted by 8 different expert alienists, or psychiatrists, as we call them now. One of those doctors was actually Dr. Austin Flint, who, if you recognize that name, that's because he played a big role in the Isabella J. Martin and Baby John story. So I thought that was kind of cool. The examination lasted for an hour and a half, which they said was very rushed. It would normally take longer than that. But they were all really just trying to look at his physical health, because originally it was the jail physician who had told the district attorney that morning that he was too sick to go to trial. And so the district attorney was like, whatever, I don't trust you. Like, I will never trust you. And so he wanted other people to see him. These specialists, these 8 doctors, even though they were more like along the lines of mental health, still they're able to assess someone physically. So they all said he was physically well enough to withstand the strain of the trial. As for his mental state, they were divided, but they would make a more thorough, longer examination the following day. That examination happened Thursday, February 5th of 1903. They were with him for several hours, and when they were done, they had to report back to Judge Herrick. Now, this was not part of the trial. This was not going in the trial record. It was not done before the jury. It was just these 8 experts telling the judge what it was that they would be testifying to when the time came. And this report that they gave him, this changed the trajectory of the case, but it doesn't come out publicly until the following week. The trial went through the motions as usual, and Hooper continued to be a complete mess. In fact, on the morning of the second day, he had to be forcibly dressed by 3 officers, and after he was dressed, he started crawling on the floor of his cell, saying that he needed the rabbit's foot that another prisoner had used while he was on trial. So I don't know, it was just kind of weird. He's not doing well. He looks like, there's some mental illness there. Well, what the 8 expert alienists had told the judge was that they found Hooper Young to be medically insane, but not legally insane. The difference between these two is that medically insane is a clinical diagnosis. So it means he has a mental illness, basically. Legally insane is a specific court determination. You can be diagnosed with a severe mental illness, by doctors, but still be considered legally sane by a judge or jury. Basically, if you know that you're doing something bad, then you're not legally insane. Judge Herrick looked at the case in front of him, right? This is a death penalty case. And he knows that there is some severe mental illness in this man. However, he obviously did something he knew was wrong. So Judge Herrick's thinking about this, and it's just eating at him. And he realized that it was possible that he, the judge, may have to actually sentence a medically insane man to death at the end of this. And he personally just did not feel right about that. On Sunday, February 8th, Judge Herrick spoke to both D.A. Jerome and defense attorney Hart and suggested that they make a plea deal for second-degree murder with a life sentence. And that day, that Sunday, there were numerous secret conferences. D.A. Jerome thought it over, and after a while, he actually agreed with the plea deal. The reason why he agreed was because he wasn't sure that this jury of 12, just regular people would completely understand the difference between medical and legal insanity. And it would take just one of those men to confuse the two, which would have resulted in what's called a compromise verdict, which would have ended with a life sentence anyway. So, they may say, yes, he's guilty of first-degree murder, but, we suggest giving him mercy and life instead of death. So they had that option. So the way D.A. Jerome saw it, this was going to save the county a lot of money, and it would likely wind up with the same result. Attorney Hart, of course, was very, very pleased that this would take the death penalty off the table. His goal was to save the life of Hooper Young, and he later said this was just the first step. He was going to try to get it changed to manslaughter eventually and try to get him put into a hospital eventually and, hope that he would be free someday. So Mr. Hart had some lofty goals. On the morning of Monday, February 9th, when the trial reconvened, it started a little differently than usual. Judge Herrick said,
Young, stand up. Young.
Hooper was seemingly out in space, right? And so his brother, J. Wesley Young, grabbed him by the arm and lifted him to his feet.
William Hooper Young, I understand you desire to change your plea of not guilty to this indictment to guilty of murder in the second degree. Is that right?
He didn't answer, so the judge had to ask him again, and then he weakly said,
Yes, murder in the second degree. I am willing to accept that plea on the recommendation of the district attorney and of your counsel for the reasons which have developed in this trial. You understand that there is only one penalty, that of a life sentence. Do you want to be sentenced now?
Hooper hung his head and did not answer, so again the question had to be repeated.
Say yes.
whispered Hart in Hooper's ear.
Yes, Your Honor.
He said, and it was barely above a whisper.
I then sentence you to imprisonment in state prison at hard labor for the rest of your natural life. Sit down.
Well, he stood still.
Sit down.
Said Herrick sharply. His brother dragged him down to his seat, and then soon after he was rushed back over to the tombs. Attorney Hart later made a statement. He told reporters that he had talked at length with Hooper Young, trying to find out what happened the night of the murder.
I'm prepared to say that he is today suffering from mental delusion. He is delusionarily insane. I believe that Young is thoroughly honest in his delusion that somebody else committed the crime. He has held all along that he was innocent. In the face of the most convincing evidence, and without attempting any explanation of his action during the time the crime was committed, he has stubbornly refused to acknowledge his guilt. If he was shamming insanity, he was shamming to me as well as to the public.
2 days later, on February 11th, 1903, Hooper Young requested all of the reporters come to his cell in the tombs. And he said again, he's not insane and he is completely innocent of this crime.
As God is my judge, I did not kill Annie Pulitzer. Murder will out, and this murder will surely be brought to the door of the guilty one. And why did I plead guilty to the crime? Because I wanted to save my family from the disgrace of having a member of it sent to the electric chair.
And 2 days after that, on February 13th of 1903, Hooper Young was moved to Sing Sing prison. He and 5 other prisoners were driven over to the Grand Central Station in a Black Maria.
The Black Maria was a horse-drawn police wagon used to transport prisoners. Similar to modern-day paddy wagon, it was designed to securely move people in police custody between jails, courthouses, train stations, and other locations. By the early 1900s, the term was widely recognized, and newspapers frequently referred to these prisoner wagons simply as Black Marias.
As usual, there was a huge crowd gathered to see him at the train station. The crowd pushed up so close to the wagon that a newspaper cameraman was shoved right up next to it, and that happened right as Hooper started to step out of the wagon. And so he kicked the photographer in the neck with his right foot.
Damn you, take that!
The crowd backed off, and Hooper was rushed over to the train platform. After getting on the train at the Grand Central Station, he borrowed a hat from another prisoner, and he covered his face all the way to Ossining, where Sing Sing is located. As they approached the prison, he pretended to collapse, and nobody paid him any attention, and then he just straightened back up when they reached the station. A huge crowd followed him down the railroad track to the prison, and they were jeering at him. He cursed at the photographers who had been lined up along the track, and he tried to actually hit one with a rock that he kicked. When he got into Sing Sing, his hair was cut and his face was shaved. He was put in a prison suit and given a number. Then he was moved to cell number 613 in Gallery 13 on the top tier of the main block in the prison. After that, the name Hooper Young disappears from the papers. 12 years later, in 1915, it's reported that he won a contest in the prison. There was a play presented at the prison on Christmas Day of 1914. It was called Sinners, written by Owen Davis. There was a prize of $100 up for grabs, and it would go to the prisoner who wrote the best critique of the play. And 44-year-old William Hooper Young won the prize, which shouldn't come as a surprise. He had worked in journalism, for a long time. Now, 2.5 years later, in September of 1917, there was an article saying that some notorious inmates have been given positions of trust. And basically, this was when the war was going on. And this article said the whole atmosphere had changed in the prison due to World War I. The inmates were far less violent with each other because at this point, the whole country kind of pulled together now that there's a common enemy. And I remember this happening after 9/11 happened. Suddenly, people weren't as politically divided because we were all Americans. You know what I mean? So apparently in the prison, that made a big difference, and things just became calm and peaceful. A lot of people were now trustworthy and given these positions of trust. But Hooper Young, his position was weird. The article listed Hooper Young as the prison's inventor, and it said that he claims to have perfected a device which would end the war, like immediately. 14 months after that, November 2nd of 1918, an article said that he had been dabbling in experiments trying to make the sun's rays cure all ills. And then we see in February of 1919 that Hooper is possibly being transferred back to Sing Sing. That confused me. I did not see any articles about him having been transferred out of Sing Sing, but I did see something, written in 1950 that said that he had been in 3 different prisons before being paroled for this. So I know that he was somewhere else, but he was possibly going back to Sing Sing in 1919. Now, he was possibly paroled in 1921. That's stated in that news article written in 1950. Or he was possibly paroled in 1924, which is stated on his Wikipedia page. But neither of these sources are truly trustworthy. I think I would probably go with Wikipedia before I would go with that newspaper article, because the newspaper article was written decades later, and I've seen time and time again that when a story is written about a crime decades after the fact, most of it is not correct. So yeah, but on Wikipedia, there aren't even any sources, citing any sources when it gives those dates. So I don't know for sure, and I don't know. He was arrested again in California in 1938 when he was about 67, and he was put in Folsom Prison, and he actually died there in 1939 at the age of 68. This information comes from Wikipedia. We know for sure he did wind up in prison in California because he is buried there, and we even have his mugshot. But details about his arrest just aren't there. I found no news of him being arrested in California or even of him dying. There's nothing in the newspapers. And that's the story of Hooper Young and Annie Pulitzer. But what really gets under my skin is that nobody ever solved the central mystery. What happened that night? When I saw that her clothes were torn, that they found in the trunk, it made me think of his story, that he found her unconscious and he ripped her clothes open, to try to help her breathe. There was a ripped petticoat. There were all kinds of things of her clothes that had been torn. And so it made his story sound kind of true. But yeah, so what happened? Why didn't Annie make it back home after buying the cakes and rolls? How on earth did she wind up in the apartment of William Hooper Young? Why did she get into a cab with him to go to his house when she was supposed to go back home and have cocoa with her husband?
Did he even kill her? Was there actually another man? Did he genuinely believe the Charles Simpson Eiling story?
Was he medically insane? Was he faking? Did he even remember what actually happened that night?
We'll never know.
We'll never know.
Shout outs. Shout out to newspapers.com, ancestry.com, familysearch.com, findagrave.com, pixabay.com, my brother, Christian.
Yes, all of his awesome commercials.
Follow us on Facebook, Forgotten Felonies. It is now public, so you can just join.
Yep, and go look at all the pictures and everything.
Leave us a review.
Yes, please. We like reviews when they're positive.
And they all have been so far.
Yay.
And share this with your friends. Share us.
Yeah.
Pass us around.
Oh, my.
we're Tenderloin gals, if you please.
No, we're not. Oh, boy. There's so much I left out. So many details. When his mom came, things his mom said, things his dad said, and stuff. But it was well, I'm already age 24. You know what I mean?
This is why we need a Patreon, where we add that stuff in.